thought. You know, you have this sort of like incidence of effeminate males that occur in society, and all throughout childhood they are a lot of times people try to correct them. They try to correct their gender behavior. And a lot of times, like, it's more acceptable for a female to be a tomboy than a male to be a sissy.
Right.
You know, because it has a lot more negative connotations. And not only that, but, like, as the boy begins to grow up, or as the male begins to grow up and realize they're different from others in some way as far as their gender expression, they start to be ridiculed by friends, by peers in school, you know, and it can lead to mental and physical violence, and it can also lead to like self-mental and physical violence because of the self-hatred created by ideals of gender and this like black and white gender dichotomy of there only being two selections for gender expression. It's either masculine or feminine, or male or female, or man or woman, or gay or straight, you know, which, I mean, that's sexuality, but which is separate. It sort of gets included in there. So this sort of brings me to not only like feminism to include people who have feminine expression, but also feminism, like how could... Let me rephrase that. How could one apply what we were just quoting from Miss Mary W?
Mary.
What we quoted from Mary and how that applies to effeminate males who decide to transition. Because, you know, it makes me think of maybe in the same way a woman may sort of reclaim or try to claim power in a way that is sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of oppression through their physical image and their physical attractiveness. What if, in a sense, effeminate males are doing that in some way by conforming to the gender binary, by stepping out of that gray area that they're in by being an effeminate male to becoming a male to female transsexual, and then all of a sudden through the power of hormones and plastic surgery they're this goddess of femininity. And
you have to pass. That's
exactly. Well, not only pass, but then, you know, when I think about transsexual porn and, you know, a lot of the porn stars that are included as these huge big names in she-male porn and tranny porn. She-male porn is these women who are not only passing on the outside as like a genetic female, but they have like an exaggeration of femininity. You often see like tiny waists, like extremely tiny waists coupled with enormous siliconized hips and huge breast implants and gigantic lips. I mean, you see that with genetic females as well, but there's a high incidence of transsexuals that express gender in that way. And it just makes me think about, you know, this sort of imprisonment of the body and policing oneself.
I keep the service bell by my bed for you.
And it's very interesting because, you know, with my experience of the transsexual adult industry, when a she-male or a transsexual decides to have bottom surgery and have female genitalia constructed, they lose their value, almost.
Yeah.
In all incidents.
That's interesting.
Like, they no longer hold their value because they no longer have a penis anymore, so...
The kink or whatever that
the
they were making out of their gender identity. Yeah. So the whole, like, I don't know, the juxtaposition of having femininity of mythological and epic proportions through plastic surgery, but at the same time having male genitalia. That's intense.
They're not only held to having to have a very high standard of expression of femininity and having to pass as not only as genetic females, but as, you know, these gorgeous, flawless, fabulous women that also, you know, without their ability to perform as a male in bed and get an erection and have the ability to orgasm.
You know, what's really interesting is that, like, the way that we map sexuality onto the body is gendered. And actually one of the interesting things about this is, like, what is said a lot of the times is because we perceive males as somehow more disembodied than women, than females. Whatever. The penis is the only place that a manly man can receive physical affection and get really into it and be sexual. Whereas for the woman, her whole body is viewed as like a sexual field. But, you know, and you see that in porn, like sometimes they won't show the man's face, and they'll only show like from the perspective of someone like looking down at their own genitals. But it's also just in general, I think like men consider themselves more as like needing to be the aggressors in sex and not like someone who can passively receive touching. So it's almost like they are just trying to combine, there's almost like a double pressure to perform both male and female sexuality if you're in that situation of the transsexual that you're describing. Because like if all that's required, of male sexuality is that you have a penis, you know, then that's all you need, you know, and it's totally, yeah, that's really, I've never thought about that.
Well, it's really interesting. I never really thought about it that way either until I started talking about it, you know, about this whole two forms of pressure being put on the transsexual. But, you know, when we start talking about like the body being a prison, you have very high incidence of transsexual women doing very risky things in order to have this high ideal of, or express this ideal of femininity. You know, you have a lot of transsexuals who will use massive amounts of hormones beyond what is recommended for transsexuals by the medical profession. Yeah. You have a large incidence of transsexuals, especially amongst lower income groups, using injectable silicone in order to maintain this body that they strive for. There's a lot of transsexuals that will inject, you know, silicone in various parts of the body, not just the hips and the cheeks and the lips and the breasts and the usual places, but, you know, you have things like calves and, you know, so on and so forth. So, you know, in order to feminize the body. And in a lot of cases, especially amongst lower income communities, these procedures are being performed by people who do not have a medical license, and in a lot of cases, the silicone is not pure in quality, and also, unfortunately, there's a lot of cases of it not being silicone at all. There's cases of people
I heard about that recently.
Being mineral oil or floor wax or industrial grade silicone. And it's really prevalent amongst racial minority groups of transsexuals because, you know, there's a high incidence of sex work that goes on, especially with lower income transgendered people, and it becomes sort of like a vicious cycle of maintaining this image and getting money to pay for these things, and then turning to sex work for that to pay for it, and then, you know, of course having to maintain this image for the clients, and then of course being entertainers and showgirls. And it would seem to me that a lot of people that were born genetically male that have extremely feminine expression and choose to alter their bodies in a quest to reclaim power sort of do that through sex. And at least in a lot of my personal experience and those I've come in contact with, it would seem like, you know, we have this tendency to reclaim that power and get this attention on stage through drag performances, but through sex as well. You know, in the beginning years of my transition, I absolutely lived for the attention that came from being recognized as a sexy female, you know, and being an oversexed, highly, you know, feminine female. And it sort of like made me feel like I had a place, because prior to that, you know, being in that ambiguous gray area, you know, I was often, instead of receiving compliments and instead of receiving, you know, praise and adoration, I was receiving, you know, verbal violence and threats and attacks, and